Andrew from SACS, and welcome to video number 1 in our 6-video sequence on the psychology of power. You might ask, why would we make a video about the psychology of power? Well, the answer is very simple. In organisations, power matters enormously. If you've ever struggled with a restructure in an organisation, for instance, that's because some people get power and some people lose power in restructures, and that makes people very agitated. This video sequence starts off with the question of what is power. We give you an evidence-based perspective on power and what it is in terms of the psychology of how people interact, but also the effects that come from it. We then look at some historical rises to power, both ancient and contemporary, and we talk about what are the characteristics that cause people to be able to rise to power. Then we'll talk about the neuroscience of power. Power and the gaining of power changes us neurologically. We change our perspectives on a range of different things. We become, for instance, much worse at perspective taking than we were when we didn't have power. Humble people are better at perspective taking than people who are primed with power. In other words, we can't see things from other people's point of view so well when we consider ourselves to be powerful. Then we talk about where does it come from, and personality, for instance, can that predict power? And the answer is yes. There are certain personality characteristics that relate to power and cause people to be more likely to cause power. But then we talk about values and power. And that is to say that if we know the values of a particular individual, they can cause them to seek power, but they can also cause them to acquire power. So if I have a set of values that accords with your set of values, you are far more likely to accord me power than if you feel that our values are antagonistic to each other, for instance. And finally, we talk about avoiding the negatives of power at work. Examples of the negatives are things like, for instance, the fact that when people rise up levels of seniority, they gain power. Their behaviour can change. And so what we'll do is we'll talk about some tools that can be used to assess the likelihood of somebody changing their behaviour for the negative by virtue of gaining power. And also, if the person is doing that, what we can do to coach, guide, and support them to be more reasonable or more balanced in the way that they interact with other people. Probably one of the most famous quotes in the history of psychology of power: "Power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely," from John Dahlberg Acton. And it's absolutely right. If you look at people who have assumed power, it's in fact quite rare for people to assume power and not give away some of their sensitivity or decision-making capability. Power does corrupt, and it certainly seems in the later videos you'll see some evidence of the fact that things like perspective taking is reduced by acquisition of power. People are not so good at seeing things from other people's points of view. But as well as that, decision-making can be heavily affected by people assuming power. What is power? Well, it's the individual's capacity to modify other states by providing or withholding resources or administering punishment. It's not a very attractive sentence, that, but still in all, it's an accepted definition of power in psychology. And the resources can be social, such as friendship and those kinds of things, but they can also be material resources, such as money or positions or whatever. In addition to that, we find that the value of power is reflected in how dependent the individual is on these resources, and this gives rise to a thing that's sometimes called the principle of least interest. The principle of least interest is simple. The person who has the least interest in a relationship has the greatest power. In other words, if somebody's seeking to build a partnership with you and you're thinking, well, I don't really need this partnership and maybe it's not important and maybe it could be okay, but I'm not very committed, but they're very committed. Well, clearly you have the greatest power because you have the power of refusal. By the way, people with broken hearts over the years have reflected on this, and it is a really important characteristic of the nature of power that the person with the least interest has the greatest power. That capacity, that preparedness to walk away is very powerful. A guy by the name of Raven conducted research into power and came up with 6 bases of power. The first is reward. In other words, you have power if you're able to confer rewards on people. Makes sense. That can provide a kind of an incentive power. Secondly, there's coercion. Obviously, if you can punish people if they do what you don't want them to do, then that gives you power. And we've seen that in formal authorities throughout the ages where people have used that coercion power. Then there's legitimate opposition power. Legitimate or position power is where you gain authority by the nature of your position. So some positions, let's say you're a minister of a crown in a Western democracy, that gives you a certain amount of position power, it gives you a certain legitimacy. Whereas, let's say if you're a religious leader, it gives you a certain amount of legitimacy in respect of, let's say, moral or religious issues. Then there's expert power. If you know something that other people don't, and you're held to be an expert, then of course that can give you a decision-making power, but it can also give you a leadership power. People will be inclined to follow you if you have that expert authority. Then there's referent power. And referent power is something to do with the fact that people want to be associated with you. They want to give you a recognition based on who you are or what you do. So an example of that might be sports stars advertising cars. I mean, what has sports stardom got to do with cars? Well, the thing is that that's referent power. This person is seen to be successful or authoritative or whatever. And so the person gets that referent power and the decision to buy the car happens, even though really, I guess from a logical point of view, it doesn't make a great deal of sense. And then there's informational power. Informational power is the capacity to cause people to change their behaviours based on the information that you give them. And you get power by either giving information or withholding information. So you can use that as a kind of a reward as well. I will give you information which helps you to do what you want to do, and I will withhold information based on the fact that I don't favour you or something like that. So in wartime, of course, this is called propaganda, and the old quote is that the first fatality of the war is the truth, because governments are really keen to ensure morale and those kinds of things in amongst their populace, and that's a classic example of informational power. So 6 bases of power. In the next video, what we'll be talking about is historical rises to power. I think it's just fascinating to see the way that some people have come to power basically out of the blue, whereas other people come from a legitimate position, either a family or maybe they're the son of a king or something like that. But what's really fascinating is where you see people rise to power in an unpredictable fashion. That's in the next video. Click on the link near this one to join us.